In the land where even faith seemed to bow before the power of Rome, a man walked in silence. He was not the most eloquent, he was not the most exalted, but his doubts, so human, have echoed through the centuries and still move us. While the other apostles discussed kingdoms and promises, he observed, and when Jesus spoke of invisible paths, it was he who dared to ask what no one else had the courage to say out loud. His name was Thomas, reduced by history to an adjective, doubting. Few know what lies behind that touch upon the wounds. Few understand the pain of someone who saw Christ die and had to wait alone for the resurrection. Thomas did not doubt out of weakness. He doubted because he loved too much to believe easily, and it was precisely that brutal honesty that led him to touch heaven through the wounds. But what happened after that encounter with the risen one? Why did Thomas disappear from the biblical narrative only to reappear centuries later in accounts of distant lands? And what does his journey to the east reveal about the silences of faith? How did a Jewish apostle end up on the shores of ancient India? Why did he choose the forgotten instead of the centers of power? And what was the true legacy of the one who dared to doubt and then dared to believe to the end? Before we follow this road of shadows and revelations, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, no hidden story and no silenced truth will go unnoticed by you. Now then, get ready to uncover the hidden truth behind the astonishing story of Thomas. Let's begin now. The sky over Bethsaida darkened early in those days. The clouds carried more than rain. They carried a weight that people could not name. Judea was a land silenced under the sandals of Rome's soldiers, and among the muffled cries of tribute and the prayers that no longer found echo in the temple, lived Thomas, a man of few gestures, deep gaze, hands calloused like those of fishermen, though he had never cast nets. Didymus the twin, they said, but no brother was in sight. Some whispered that his twin had died at birth. Others said he had never existed. Thomas did not explain, nor did he deny it. The name was his invisible scar. He moved through the markets with his body present and his soul absent. He worked among caravans and tents, repairing jars, selling stone utensils, and listening to conversations he did not want to keep. The zealots spoke of revolt, the Pharisees of purity, the Sadducees of taxes, but he no longer believed in anything. Faith in his mouth had become a quiet ash. He did not deny God. He simply no longer expected anything from him. His father had died under orders of a Roman officer accused of hiding tribute. His mother, silent ever since, did not even utter the emperor's name, as if doing so could erase him. Thomas grew up among stifled prayers and mourning silence. His face did not bow before priests, nor did it smile at the hopes of street prophets. He was a whole man split in two. Until one day the wind changed in the village. It wasn't the sound of coins, nor the arrival of Syrian camels. It was a voice, firm yet gentle. A man spoke among fishermen and the destitute as if he knew their innermost being. "Blessed are those who mourn," he said, and eyes that had been dry for years began to burn again. Thomas did not come close at once. He listened from afar. He did not believe in teachers. He had seen many, but there was something there that pierced his logic like a splinter under the skin. That man, the Nazarene, spoke with the same serenity with which time shapes the rocks. His presence was not aggressive, but it exposed as if he was seeing what everyone tried to hide, including Thomas. Days later he returned to the same place. The man was still speaking, but now he was saying names, calling ordinary people as if fishing for hearts. Simon, Andrew, John, Matthew, names from the people, the mud, the corner. Thomas listened with clenched jaw. "And you," the voice reached him like an arrow. He had not seen the man approach, but there he was, standing before him, eyes fixed on his. "Do you know me?" Thomas asked. The man only smiled. "More than you imagine." That night, Thomas did not sleep. The stranger's voice invaded his thoughts like an old psalm he was trying to forget. More than you imagine. No one had ever looked at him like that, as if not interested in his answers, but in his wounds. Days later, Thomas followed the group from a distance. He did not join them, he observed, but with each step he took, something in his chest broke apart. It was not faith, it was hunger, a hunger he no longer knew how to name. He who had always avoided being like the others now found himself walking like them, like a soundless call, like a lamp lit in a cave. Then everything went silent. The man stopped before the sea. The disciples sat down, but Thomas, hesitant, stayed behind a rock. The breeze blew gently. The Nazarene looked at him, not with accusation but with tenderness. "Are you thirsty, Didymus?" he asked without raising his voice. "I'm not." Thomas tried to deny it, but the words failed him. For the first time in years he tasted a tear. He had not cried since his father's burial. The answer came without sound. The man did not insist. He simply turned and began speaking to the crowd. "Blessed are those who do not need to see to believe." Thomas understood that the phrase was meant for him, and that it was only the beginning. Doubt until then his armor began to crack. The darkness he inhabited now had a sliver of light. And for the first time Thomas felt fear not of the world, but of what might happen if he let himself be reached. That night he returned home changed. He had not declared himself a disciple. He had made no promises, but something in him had changed. Or perhaps for the first time, something had been awakened. Time would pass, miracles would come, blood would be shed, but on that forgotten corner of Galilee, amid dust and doubt, a man was called, and even if he didn't know it, that calling already echoed in the abyss between his reason and his soul, a calling in the darkness. John 11:16. They called him Didymus the twin, but no one knew of another. No brother walked beside him, no sign of a family torn in half. The name had become a wandering shadow, an echo no one answered, and Thomas, used to silence, did not explain. He never said whether he had lost someone, whether the name came from blood or from metaphor. He simply carried it as if it were part of his body, a name that was more a question than an identity. Among the 12, he was the quietest. He did not vie for a place at the table, did not rush to ask questions, did not laugh when the others laughed. He walked among them as one who heard more than he saw, and saw more than he said. He was the restrained presence among the extremes, the apostle on the margin. While Peter spoke with fire, John with tenderness, and Judas with calculation, Thomas observed. Jesus had called him without ceremony, just the name and a look. No miracle, no promise, as if he already knew that this man would only follow if drawn by the deepest truth, the kind not proven by arguments, but by scars. And he followed, always one step behind, always alert, like someone walking on ground that might give way. On the roads of Galilee, he carried small stones in his pockets. No one knew why. They said it was a childhood habit, others thought it was superstition, but the truth is that he collected them wherever he stopped, one from each place, to remember he had been there, that he had seen, that he had heard. He trusted stones more than words. Stones do not lie. When Jesus spoke about the kingdom, Thomas listened with narrowed eyes. He did not doubt, but he processed. Faith for him was not breath, it was excavation. He did not follow because he believed. He followed to discover if he could believe. And perhaps that was what the Master saw in him, a silent thirst that rejected deception. On cold nights in Capernaum while the others slept around the fire, Thomas stayed awake. He watched the stars like someone searching for meaning beyond the parables. There was a weight in him that was not sadness, but too much lucidity, as if he had been born seeing the cracks of the world before its beauty. One morning Jesus announced they would return to Judea. The news brought chills. Lazarus had died and the path there was filled with danger. The disciples hesitated. Peter looked away. Philip questioned, but it was Thomas who spoke few words, without emotion. Let us also go that we may die with him. No one expected that from him. The one who never spoke now spoke with steel. It was not theatrical courage. It was acceptance. If the path led to death, let it be with dignity. That phrase spoken without fanfare revealed what everyone had overlooked. Thomas was more faithful than he appeared. He did not believe easily, but when he believed, he went all the way. Jesus looked at him in that moment. He did not smile, but the silence between them said more than any blessing. The others resumed the journey, but from that point on something fell silent between them, a dense respect. Thomas did not seek glory. He sought coherence, and for that he stayed. Some said he was the cracked mirror of the others, that his questions reflected the doubts they all had, but would not admit. Others called him a skeptic, but he knew doubt was not denial. It was wanting something firmer than slogans. It was asking for a foundation that could bear the weight of the soul. In the crowds, he saw faces like his people who wanted to believe but couldn't. People who had heard too many prophets and too few promises. People who had been wounded by leaders, by doctrines, by frustrated hopes. He saw himself in them, and so he walked with them in silence. He was a disciple not only of Christ, but of shared pain. Once a man came asking for healing. He cried, pleaded, begged. Jesus said nothing, he simply touched him. The man fell to the ground weeping. Thomas stepped back not because he doubted the miracle but because he needed to understand what that changed in the world. The healing of one amid the suffering of all disturbed him as if each miracle carried within it the memory of those who were not healed. Still, he did not leave. Perhaps because deep down, even with his stones, even with his doubt, there was in him a faith that could only be born from friction. A faith that was not a shout, but an exposed wound. Didymus, the one who observes, the one who weighs, the one slow to believe, but who never stopped seeking. Among the 12, he was the only one who did not want easy answers. And perhaps because of that, he was the most prepared to find Christ in the dark. If this content is touching you in any way, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like and share. Your presence here makes all the difference. Let's take a deep breath and return to the journey. The news came like a cold blow. Lazarus was dead. The words arrived mixed with the dust of the road and Martha's anxious gaze. Jesus' face remained calm, but his eyes darkened. The disciples exchanged silent glances. Returning to Judea meant more than consoling a family. It was walking into the territory of death. The grief of a friend mingled with the looming threat of persecution. They had already tried to stone him. There were murmurs, ambushes, leaders ready to crush any sign of hope. Going back was to provoke the wound. "Let us go to him," said the Master. The phrase sounded simple, but no one moved. Peter hesitated, fists clenched. John stepped back slightly. Philippa looked at the ground. The idea of returning to the region that wanted the Nazarene's head was more than uncomfortable. It was suicide. The tension hung in the air like a suspended blade. Then Thomas's voice broke the silence. "Let us also go, that we may die with him." The phrase, spoken without a shout, without theatrics, dropped like a stone in the middle of the group. Everyone turned, surprised. Thomas, the reserved, the skeptical, now stepped forward as if he had already accepted the end. There was no bravado in his tone, only acceptance. Death for him was not defeat, it was coherence. If that man was worthy to be followed, then he should be followed wherever the road led, even if that road ended in a tomb. The phrase echoed in the minds of the others. They followed, but something changed among them. There was now a weight. Each step toward Bethany felt deeper than the last. The air grew heavier, as if the land itself knew what was coming. Thomas walked in silence, ahead of some, behind others, but his face was like stone. Within him, something ancient was awakening. A loyalty that no longer depended on proof. Judea did not welcome them with flowers, nor with stones, but with sharp looks. Roman soldiers patrolled the roads, priests whispered between the temple columns. The name of Jesus was spoken with clenched teeth and fearful voices. In Bethany, mourning mixed with the bitter smell of vinegar and sweat. Lazarus's body had already been buried. For days the sisters were spent. Jesus wept. The first time Thomas saw the Master cry, it was not theatrical lament, it was raw pain. And there, before that weeping, something was sealed in Thomas's heart, because he recognized in that tear the same one he had carried since his father's death, a man who cries for a dead friend that no one can fake. But it wasn't the weeping that split history, it was the command, "Lazarus, come out." And death, like a shamed servant, returned what it had taken. The dead man walked out of the tomb. The crowd screamed. Martha collapsed. Mary sobbed and Thomas stood still. He didn't run. He didn't shout. But inside him, a wall cracked. The man he would follow to death now bent death itself, like someone opening an ancient door. Reality seemed to flee from logic, and even so, there it was. The impossible had happened. The news spread like wildfire. Lazarus's resurrection spread, not as hope, but as threat. The temple leaders trembled. The crowd grew. The death plots intensified, and more than ever, the group knew that walking with the Nazarene was walking toward the abyss. There was no turning back, the time of doubt had passed. Now was the time of decision. That afternoon, Thomas sat under the shade of an olive tree. The stone he had picked up from the side of the road was now in his fingers. He looked at it like someone consulting an oracle. It was rough, real, and yet there was the dead alive. How to deal with that? How to reconcile what is seen with what is felt? Reason screamed. The soul wept, but he didn't run. For the first time, he didn't run from contradiction. While the others celebrated the miracle, Thomas stared at the horizon. He knew that every healing, every sign hastened the end. Glory awakened fury, life provoked death, and he, the silent twin, saw himself ever closer to the sword. The group left Bethany, but the silence on the road was denser than before, because now they knew what Thomas had already sensed. Following Christ meant following him to the cross. Even if it wasn't yet visible, its outline could already be felt in the air. The phrase would be remembered many times, "Let us also go that we may die with him," not as a lament, but as a vow. A vow Thomas made not to the miracle, but to the truth, because there is a faith born of sight, and another, rarer, born of the acceptance of the end. The upper room was filled with thick silence. The smell of baked bread and poured wine hung in the air, but there was no celebration. That night was unlike the others. The shadow of the inexplicable fell over every face. The disciples felt it, even without naming it. Something was saying goodbye, even though still present. The Master had washed their feet, broken the bread, spoken of betrayal, and now his eyes scanned their faces like one saying farewell before departure. Thomas remained quiet as usual, but inside restlessness spun like a blade. The Nazarene's words that night confused him. "I go to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many rooms, and you know the way." It made no sense. It wasn't Jerusalem, nor Rome, nor Samaria. It was another kind of departure, and Thomas could not bear riddles. The faith he had left needed ground, not metaphors. The others listened in silence, perhaps pretending to understand, but Thomas leaned forward. The doubt that had always accompanied him now demanded to speak. He did not speak out of rebellion. He spoke because the gap between hope and reality had become unbearable. "Lord," he said in a restrained voice, "we do not know where you are going. How then can we know the way?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, everyone seemed to breathe at once. It was everyone's doubt voiced by one. And Jesus, far from being offended, turned to him with eyes that mixed tenderness and fire. The answer was not an explanation. It was a revelation. "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." In that moment, something in the air broke. The answer was not logic. It was presence. Not a map, a person. Thomas fell silent. The phrase was bigger than him, bigger than fear, than doubt, than Roman spears and priestly decrees. The road he tried so hard to understand now had a face. It was not about knowing the destination, but about following the one who walked. And that for Thomas was both liberating and terrifying. The wine was passed, the bread broken, the songs began. But Thomas did not sing. He was still bound to that answer. I am the way. It was as if the words echoed in the walls of his soul. He had always sought proof, roots, reasons, and now he received an invitation without guarantees, except the presence of a man who spoke as one who had come from the center of the universe. When they left for the mount, Thomas walked behind, eyes on the ground and mind in turmoil. The Nazarene walked ahead. Even knowing what was to come. And there, under the moon of Gethsemane, the silent twin understood that faith was not knowing where one is going. It was trusting the one who calls, even when everything seems to fall apart. Years later, many would repeat that phrase, I am the way, but few would remember it came from a question, and even fewer that it was Thomas who dared to speak it aloud, because doubting in that moment was not weakness, it was courage. Courage to admit not knowing, and to ask for more, not a road, but a living certainty. That night would end in blood, in arrest, in muffled cries in the Sanhedrin, but in that moment, before the cross, before the scourge, before the silence of Saturday, Jesus placed in Thomas a response that was a key for all futures. Because every disciple sooner or later faces the same question, where is the one we love going? And every faith must relearn how to hear, not where, but with whom. Thomas's doubt was a seed, and that night, even without seeing it, began to grow. The sky was gray, but it wasn't raining. It was as if even the weather hesitated to console. The body had been taken away, the tomb sealed, and the blood on the stones already blended with the dust. The Nazarene had been executed, humiliated, stripped before Rome and religion. What remained was silence. The disciples had hidden, each in a different corner. Hope crumbled into fear. The promised kingdom now seemed like nothing more than an echo muffled by the cross. Thomas, however, was not with them. No one knew where he had gone. Some said he went to Bethany, others that he returned home, but the truth is that he walked along the edges of the city like a wounded animal. He couldn't bear the confinement of collective grief. The lament of others suffocated him. He preferred the solitude of despair to the sharing of a broken hope. He had always been that way. When the world collapsed, Thomas didn't cling to walls. He disappeared. Not out of cowardice, but because absence was the only refuge he still trusted. The image of the hanging body still burned in his memory. Not the crown, not the nails, but the silence of the one who always spoke. Jesus had not reacted, had not protested. He only looked, and that gaze, even from afar, pierced Thomas to the bone. Let us also go that we may die with him. He had said days earlier, but he had not died. He had stayed, and now alive, he felt like a traitor to his own promise. The following days were a blur. He ate poorly, slept little, avoided main streets, observed the rumors from afar, confused guards, nervous priests, women saying the tomb was empty. Thomas listened but did not yield. He had been misled by emotions before. This time he wanted fact, not emotional hopes of those who weep too soon. That night, while the others were locked away, Jesus appeared to them. The doors were closed, yet he entered, showed his hands, his wounded side, breathed peace over the frightened. The presence was like fire and wind. They touched, saw, believed, but Thomas was not there. When he returned, he found out radiant faces, wide eyes, voices repeating in unison, "We have seen the Lord." But to him those words felt like thorns, as if the resurrection had made a point to happen when he couldn't see it, as if, once again, he was on the outside of the miracle. Unless I see, unless I touch, I will not believe. His response wasn't a challenge, it was a lament. Absence had marked him so deeply that he no longer accepted comfort without proof. He didn't want only the joy of others, he wanted the presence, the touch, the wound. In the following days, Thomas carried that emptiness like a weight on his chest. The others spoke of hope, but he lived in absence, and that was his greatest pain. Not the death of the Master, but the miracle not witnessed. The space between promise and certainty, a space where many find their faith, but his was withering. At night, he recalled the hands of Jesus, strong, calm, touching lepers, breaking bread. Now they said those hands were alive, but he hadn't seen, hadn't felt. And that separated him from the others like an invisible wall. Inside, Thomas was screaming, not against God, but against fate. Why him? Why always him? The Talmud would later say, in the time of the end, prophetic spirit will cease, and whoever says he heard will be hated by those who did not. Sota 48b. That was it. Thomas had become the one who did not hear, the one who came after, the one who was not there. And that vacuum became the battlefield of his war, not against others, but against himself. But time did not crush him. He didn't give up. He remained with the group, even carrying that absence like an open wound, because despite everything, something in him still hoped, even if it was just a chance. One last light in the darkest night. He didn't know, but the Christ he hadn't seen would return, and would return for him. 8 days between the joy of the others and his silence. 8 nights when others' smiles became invisible daggers. Thomas stayed among them, but it was as if he lived in another house. The echo of his words, "Unless I see, I will not believe," still resonated, not as defiance, but as plea. He didn't want to challenge the master. He wanted to find again the voice that had called him in the beginning. But all he had was absence. On the night of the 8th day, they were gathered again. The doors once again were locked, and once again the impossible happened. No sound, no footsteps, no wind, just presence. Jesus was there. Thomas saw him, not as an apparition, not as memory. It was him, and there was no room for denial. The eyes of Christ met his in the instant. His heart threatened to stop. The master didn't smile nor accuse. He simply said, as if resuming a paused conversation, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Stretch out your hand and put it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." John 20:27. It was the verse that would cut through the centuries, but there, in that closed room, it were words that opened Thomas's soul like a book. The invitation wasn't a test. It was an embrace offered at the most painful place. Christ wasn't demanding blind faith. He offered wounds. Thomas approached slowly. His legs trembled, his eyes fixed on the outstretched hands. There was no blood, but there were marks, deep, real, the same he had imagined night after night, now there before him. He raised his hand, hesitant. The touch was brief, but eternal. The flesh of the risen one was soft, alive, warm, and in it the hole from the nail. Not a scar, a window. His finger also touched the pierced side. It was like touching the very boundary between life and death. There was no explanation there, only surrender. The weight of logic fell like fine sand. What once seemed impossible was now undeniable. Thomas did not fall to his knees. He collapsed inside. "My Lord and my God." No other phrase was possible. No higher declaration would come from his lips. There was faith not as built certainty, but as the collapse of resistance. The man who needed to see saw, and upon seeing was undone. Jesus looked at him with tenderness. He did not rebuke, he did not exult. He simply said, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." The phrase was for Thomas, but it was for all who would come. A bridge between the generation of eyes and the generation of hearts. Not a criticism, but a promise. Thomas didn't respond. He didn't need to. That moment sealed his soul forever. The doubt that had always been his shield was now disarmed, and in its place there wasn't full certainty, but there was surrender. He hadn't understood everything, but now he knew who was the way. The others came closer, touched again, laughed through tears. But Thomas stepped aside a little, not out of shame, but because it was too sacred. He had been sought by Christ himself, not forgotten, not ignored, waited for. 8 days of silence just for that encounter. Later that same night, he sat alone on the edge of the stairs, his fingers still trembling, the stones in his pocket. One of them, small and dark, fell from his hand. He picked it up again, and for the first time he understood. Not every stone is a sign of resistance. Some are just memories of the path. That night Thomas slept, not like before, not as escape, but like one who had been reached. The sky hadn't explained everything, but it opened its hands, and that was enough. He didn't want to go. Of the 12, he was the most reluctant. Not out of fear, but because he had learned not to trust directions that came from men. Thomas had heard the risen Christ say, "Go into all the world." But while the others mapped out routes to Rome, Antioch, or Alexandria, he remained silent. His faith was not born from haste, but from listening, and in the silence, he heard. It was night when a Persian traveler arrived in the city. He was looking for a Jewish builder. He claimed to have dreamed of a man with dark eyes and a firm voice. The brothers brought him to Thomas. He looked at him with suspicion, but the traveler smiled. "Your Lord sent me." The words sent me. The words fell like a stone into calm water. Thomas didn't reply. He knew the master often called when no one expected it. And this time the call did not come through miracles, but through mission. The ship departed at dawn. Few came to say goodbye. The route was long. It would pass through Babylon, Partha Media, and then cross beyond what Jewish maps dared to draw. On board, Thomas watched the horizon with a divided heart. He wasn't seeking fame. He was obeying. The sea was unknown, the culture foreign, the gods many, but the one who had risen told him he was the way. And now Thomas had decided to follow, even without knowing where it would lead. Along the journey he encountered languages he didn't understand, customs that disturbed him, and eyes that watched him like an exotic animal. But the farther he got from Jerusalem, the more real the invisible presence of Christ became. He didn't see him, but he felt that every step was guided, and this faith, which once needed to touch, now was learning to walk in the dark. Upon reaching the banks of the Indus River, he heard of a king seeking eternal knowledge. Gondophares, a man of power, but restless. The court received him with reserve, a solitary Jew with no scrolls, no wealth, but the king had a dream. And in the dream a voice said, "The builder has arrived." Thomas was summoned. "Build me a palace that will last forever," said the king. Thomas nodded. He received gold, servants, materials, but instead of raising walls, he began distributing everything among the poor, the sick, the forgotten. The palace was invisible, the construction spiritual. When the king found out, he was furious. He ordered Thomas imprisoned, tortured, humiliated. But in prison, Thomas prayed. And the next night, the king had another dream. An angel showed him a resplendent palace in the heavens, saying, "This is what Thomas built with your gold." Upon waking, the king released him, fell at his feet, asked for forgiveness, and believed. Thus began the Eastern mission, not with speeches, but with witness, not with temples, but with surrender. Thomas moved forward without maps, without faithful followers, only with the memory of the touch and the certainty that the way went before him. The East would be his home and also his altar. Luke 17:21. The city of Tila exuded luxury and fear. Its gates were guarded by men with long spears and dry eyes. The scent of saffron and burning oil mixed with the muffled cries of servants. At the center of it all stood the palace of Gondophoros, king of Partha, lord of tributes, collector of architects. And on that morning, without omens, a man in a simple robe and gaze, shaped by the desert, stood before the throne. "I am Thomas the builder." The king examined him with skepticism. He expected a pompous Syrian or a mathematical Greek. Instead, he saw a taciturn Jew, sparse beard, steady posture, but no arrogance. "Were you sent by the gods to build me an eternal dwelling?" he asked, more in disdain than faith. Thomas replied with a discreet nod. He received the gold, the orders, the location of the land, and departed without architects, without maps, without wood. Days passed, then weeks, and Thomas bought no stones, laid no foundations. Instead, he was seen walking through the city alleys, handing coins to the lame, bringing water to lepers, feeding children thin as shadows. When servants asked, he replied, "Each brick is already in place." The rumors reached the king. Gondaries, used to being feared, felt betrayed. He summoned Thomas. "Where is my palace?" he roared. Thomas calm replied, "It is built not with stone columns, but with invisible acts, and you won't see it now, unless you leave this world." The sentence was immediate, imprisonment and flogging. Thomas didn't resist. He knew the world of kings didn't understand structures that didn't shine in the sun. And in the dark cell, as the cold bit his bones and the wounds bled in silence, he prayed, not for deliverance, but for revelation. "If you still want me on this pagan soil, then reveal yourself to the one with the throne." The next night, the king's brother, a proud and arrogant prince, fell into a fever and died before sunrise. The physicians declared the end. They prepared the body, but before the final ritual, he awoke, disoriented in tears. He looked at the king and said, I saw a palace of gold that does not age, halls without shadow, windows that breathe. And there a man with wounded hands told me, your brother paid for this with earthly gold. I built it with the gold of heaven." The king fell to his knees, ordered Thomas to be released. His eyes, now moist, sought those of the man he had beaten. But Thomas said nothing. He just looked, because you don't shape a king's heart with words, but with the silence of one who obeys the truth. In the following days, Gondophoros changed. He ordered storehouses opened, the poor to receive food, the sick to have shelter. When asked why, he answered, "Because someone built a throne in heaven with my empty hands." Thomas remained in the city for months. He didn't preach loudly, didn't open sacred scrolls. He simply walked, sat among widows, heard the cries of mothers and the laughter of children. And where there was shadow, he left the echo of a presence. The kingdom was being sown, not in marble, but in living flesh. On an afternoon of wind and fallen leaves, Gondophoros asked, "Where is this kingdom you speak of?" Thomas answered without looking at him, "The kingdom of God does not come with outward appearance, for it is within you." He didn't quote the text for convenience, but because he had lived it. The throne of Christ didn't fit in palaces. It was built in the folds of the soul. The king didn't reply, but he smiled. And that night, as the torches were extinguished, he ordered an invisible marker to be raised where no one passed. A reminder to himself, the kingdom had begun, not in stone, but in the invisible. The sea roars like a wounded animal when Thomas reaches the shore. The boat, old, groans under the waves, but remains steady. The sand that receives his feet is not that of Jerusalem, nor of Pathia. It is hot, reddish, covered with broken shells and dried flowers. The breeze smells of spices, smoke, and salt. He disembarks in a worn tunic, without a retinue, without a flag, without plans. The map that led him there was in his soul, not on parchment. It is India, a new world, a language that escapes somatic logic. Men with rings in their noses, women with eyes lined in charcoal, stone gods with multiple arms, protruding tongues, fangs, and smiles that frighten more than soothe. It is a place of long rituals, circular dances, temples that tremble to the sound of drums. Thomas watches in silence. He knows that everything he once knew will be tested there. For weeks he does not speak, he learns to listen. The words he hears sound like water on stone. They echo but do not stick. He sleeps under tents, eats plain rice, and drinks water from pots that emit the smoke of herbs. Gradually he understands that the challenge there will not be to be heard, it will be to be understood. How to speak of the invisible to those who worship colorful statues. How to proclaim a kingdom that comes in silence to a people of cries and chants. He starts with gestures. He helps set up a fisherman's tent, tends to the fever of a potter's son, carries wood for a widow, spends days beside a paralytic without saying a word. Gradually, the glances become less hostile. A child offers him a mango. An old man calls him master without an altar. The people do not understand him, but they recognize him. It is on a dry day that everything changes. The village is fasting. The priests perform rituals, burn oils, dance in circles, plead with the water deities. Nothing, the rivers have dried. The wells are dead. Then silently, Thomas picks up a vessel, kneels on the ground, and prays. He does not shout, he does not cry, he simply speaks to the invisible. Hours later, as dust covers the sky, a cloud appears, small, alone, and from nowhere, rain. Weak at first, then strong. The wounded earth breathes. The cries become songs. The villagers dance, and someone asks, "Which God did you call upon?" Thomas simply replies, "The one with no image." They do not understand, but they look at him with reverence. He then begins to preach, not in Aramaic but through stories. He tells of a man who healed lepers with a touch, who washed the feet of his servants, who rose on the third day. The language is rudimentary, but the eyes shine. The hands do what the words cannot. He draws in the sand, points to the sky, touches hearts. Over time, small groups emerge, curious women, silent men, children who repeat phrases they do not understand, but which bring peace. He does not found churches, he plants seeds, and where there was once fear, water springs forth, water from wells, from healing, from tears. One afternoon a priest confronts him, "Do you deny our gods?" Thomas looks at him. "I do not know them." The man points to a stone image with ruby eyes. "This is Varuna, lord of the seas," Thomas replies. But he obeys but does not worship. The priest trembles but remains silent. There is something in that foreigner that does not bend. The news spreads. A man with no God's face, no beseebly altard, performs miracles in silence. They say he has light in his eyes and a shadow that calms. People begin to call him the foreign Brahmin, but Thomas refuses the title. He did not come as a master, he came as a witness. At dusk he climbs a hill alone. He looks at the sky, breathes in the scent of distant incense. He has drums in the valley and prays not to see fruits but to remain faithful, because he knows that there in the heart of India, he is no longer building palaces for kings. He is shaping eternity in hearts that had never heard the name of Christ. The heat of southern India was thick like oil, and the air seemed to boil among the palm trees. The villages were scattered like seeds cast by divine hands, some with stone temples, others with mud huts, all marked by ancient rituals and fears. There, among the coastal fishermen and the rice-field peasants, Thomas walked with cracked feet, a calm gaze, and hands always open. He promised nothing, he sold nothing, but the people came. At first they came out of curiosity, then out of desperation. A boy who could not speak, a woman who had bled for years, a man who walked hunched like an animal. Thomas did not shout, did not chant long prayers. He simply approached and touched, and in the touch something happened. Not an explosion, not a flash, but a silence that broke chains. The healed could not explain. They only said the heat left their bodies, that the pain fell silent, that their eyes could see again. It was as if death for a moment had lost its license. And when they asked Thomas how he did it, he replied, "It's not me, it's his marks in me." They did not understand, but they felt it. Mark 16:17-18 said that signs would follow those who believed. They would cast out demons, speak new tongues, lay hands on the sick, and they would recover. Thomas never quoted the text, but he lived every line with his body, not out of pride, but because since touching the wounds of the risen one, his hands were never the same. One night they brought him a girl who did not move. She had been thrown into a well, and since then had not spoken a word. The mother, with eyes torn by exhaustion, knelt before him. "If your God is real, bring her back." Thomas looked at the child. He knelt, said nothing, simply placed his hand on her head. He cried, "Remember Jairus' daughter, the boy in the village of Nain, the body of Lazarus." He cried not from faith, but from memory. Minutes later the girl opened her eyes. She said, "I'm thirsty." The mother fell to the ground, screamed, kissed Thomas's feet. He simply stepped away, because each healing wounded him too. It was not magic. It was the cross pulsing beneath the skin. There were also the possessed people who convulsed on the roads, who lived in caves, who ate dirt and screamed at the sight of light. Thomas was not afraid of them. He approached with the same calm he used with children, touched their foreheads, sometimes said a single word, "Leave." Other times he simply embraced and the screams ceased, the eyes returned, the body descended from violence. Some Hindu priests accused him of sorcery, said he used tricks, hypnotized, seduced with words, but the people did not believe it because they saw what no one dared. Touch come back to life because they are dead on the inside returned, and that no ancient ritual could do. Thomas, for his part, was not swayed by the fervor. Every healing was a reminder of the Christ who washed feet, who touched the untouchables, who bled when wounded and forgave with his eyes. Thomas knew he was not the river, only the shell. At one point, a minor king, curious, asked for a demonstration. "I've heard you heal, show me." He brought his son, healthy, handsome, curious. Thomas refused. "I do not heal for spectacle. What comes from pain, I return to hope. What comes from pride, I leave to God." The king threatened him with prison. Thomas simply replied, "I have been in darker cells than this court." That night, the king's son fell ill. Fever, delirium, weak breathing. The palace descended into chaos, and the king, desperate, sent for the man he had previously scorned. Thomas went, entered the room, touched the boy, did not pray, just looked to the sky. The boy slept, and when he awoke, he asked, "Who was that holding me while I dreamed?" The king was silent. Over time, Thomas became known, not for his words, but for his scars. It was said his hands glowed at night. Others swore that dust would not cling to them, but the truth is that his hands healed because they were once hands that doubted, that touched death and found life. Each gesture was a memory of Christ, each healing a scar that did not bleed but burned. Before we continue, remember to support this project. Subscribe, leave a like, and share it with those who also value transformative stories. Now, let the story continue to speak. The temple rose like a fortress carved from belief. Washed stone towers, stairs that seemed to lead to the sky, idols with glassy eyes and open hands. The offerings filled the air with the scent of saffron, coconut milk, and fresh blood. Men in colorful robes spun in mystical dances. Women chanted with closed eyes, and the people lined up bowed in reverence. It was a world where the sacred had form, weight, and sound. And in that world Thomas became a threat. At first he was tolerated, an exotic foreigner, perhaps a lost shaman. But as his presence grew, the whispers turned to unease. He made no offerings. He did not revere images. He spoke of a God who could not be seen but who saw everything. Of a kingdom without statues but with thrones within. Of a crucified man who now lived. The priests began to realize he was no longer an outsider. He was a disruption. One afternoon they invited him to the temple not to learn but to test him. The high priest received him with a dry smile and a voice soaked in disdain. "They say your God heals, ours protects." Thomas did not back down. "Protects whom?" he replied. "The statue or the man?" A murmur followed. The elders frowned. The priest stepped forward. "This God of yours, where is he?" Thomas touched his chest, "Here and also there. But you won't see him unless you burn your idols from within." That was enough. The rumor spread. Blasphemy. They said he had insulted Shiva, ignored Vishnu, profaned the dwelling of the gods. A council was called. They accused him of witchcraft, of seducing the youth, of dissolving families with dangerous ideas. Some demanded prison, others death. But the people hesitated because the man they accused healed. Still, ambushes began. In alleys, children were instructed to stone him. Merchants denied him bread. Some villagers coerced, denounced him as a soul thief. Thomas remained silent. He did not flee, but he did not retaliate. One day, while resting under a fig tree, he was surrounded by armed men. When shouted, "Where's your God now?" he simply opened his arms, always here, even in silence. Taken to the local tribunal, he was interrogated before a restless crowd. A priest raised a golden figurine and shouted, "Who are you to deny what our eyes can see?" Thomas, with wounded hands, replied, "Because I have seen. I no longer need what moves by the hand of men." The fury nearly erupted in public execution. But at that moment, an old man stood up, blind since birth. He shouted, "This man touched my eyes, and I saw." The crowd trembled. The judges hesitated. They released him but warned, "Stay away from the temples." Thomas merely smiled, because the temple he carried had no address. But his struggle did not cease. The persecution was now silent. Twisted words, spying, attempts at poisoning, and above all, the worst enemy, the silent sky. For the first time since touching Christ's wounds, Thomas prayed and heard nothing. No vision, no dream, only the breeze and doubt. He walked along the beaches barefoot and with a weary spirit. The sea which once refreshed him now seemed to mock. "Lord, are you there?" he asked silently, but the sky remained mute. It was not denial, it was a test. The faith that once rested on touch now had to walk without ground. Still, he did not retreat. Even without answers, he preached. Even without comfort, he healed. Even without a voice, he proclaimed, because he had learned silence also shaped saints. And the Christ who once spoke in thunder also revealed himself in the echo. One night someone asked if he wasn't afraid. He replied, "Only of the day, my faith needs answers." And saying this, he walked away, his face cut by moonlight, heading toward a village that did not yet know him, but that would soon hear how the stone gods trembled when a wounded man walked in silence. It was Indian noon. The sun beat harshly on the cracked earth, and the birds fell silent to conserve energy. Thomas walked alone, away from the village, seeking shade and silence. Dust clung to his skin, the heat made his feet throb, and thirst squeezed like an invisible hand on his neck. In the distance, he saw a twisted solitary fig tree, and beside it, a well made of irregular stones. As he approached, he realized he was not alone. A woman was already there, kneeling, holding a clay jar. Her arms were strong, but her eyes bore ancient fatigue. When she noticed the foreigner, she raised her face without fear, but with suspicion. Thomas did not look away. He simply sat beside the largest stone, panting. She watched him in silence until he spoke. "Give me a drink." The words echoed more than they should have. It was not just any request, it was a memory. Many years ago, another woman at another well heard the same words from a man weary from the road. John 4:7-14 Samaria, now India, but the same Christ, the same emptiness, trying to be filled. The woman replied with irony, "Don't your kind drink from their own wells, or does your God not tolerate the water from my hands?" Thomas smiled. "Thirst knows no doctrine." She raised an eyebrow. "And your God, is he stronger than the gods here?" He didn't answer, just held out his empty hand. She hesitated but gave him water. He drank in silence. When he finished, he said, "Whoever drinks this water will be thirsty again, but there is a fountain that never dries. I drank from it, and it still sustains me." The woman fell silent, then responded harshly, "Here men lie, husbands abandon, gods demand sacrifices, and priests avoid us. What fountain doesn't dry up?" Thomas saw her pain wasn't curiosity. It was hunger, not for answers, but for rest. So he told her, not doctrinally, but with images of a carpenter who healed, of a man hung between heaven and earth, of eyes that forgave before the sin was confessed. The woman listened in silence, but her eyes welled up. "This Christ of yours, would he speak to me?" Thomas replied, "It was to a woman like you that he spoke first." She didn't smile, but she left her jar. She ran through the village, the dust, the winding paths. She told everyone about the man who spoke of the God without a face. She gathered the elders, called the mothers, even brought hesitant priests. Within hours, dozens stood around the well. Thomas did not preach. He answered questions. He did not raise his voice. He offered shade. A man approached. "She has a bad reputation." "Had 3 husbands," Thomas replied. "And who among us has never wished to erase the past?" Another said, "She talks too much." He answered, "It was hearing her cry that I saw the people's thirst." In the days that followed, the village was transformed, not by rules, but by water. The sick were visited. Enemies greeted each other. Children slept without fear. And the woman, the one who had only come to fetch water, began to be heard. She became a counselor, the ville's voice, a witness, not by title, but by satisfied thirst. Thomas remained there for weeks. He slept under the same simple roof, ate the same rice, worked alongside them. He did not isolate himself like the Brahmins. He touched, cried, smiled, and every morning before sunrise, he went to the well, not to draw water, but to remember. One afternoon the woman sat beside him. There was silence between them. She asked, "Why did you choose to speak to me?" Thomas looked into the well where light danced on the dark water. "Because once someone spoke to me, even when I didn't believe either." She nodded. She didn't need to ask anything else. At his farewell, the village followed him to the edge of the road. The woman gave him a new jar inside a small stone wrapped in cloth to remind you that water also springs from cracked earth. He left, but he didn't take disciples. He took echoes, and in his heart he knew. In that land of painted gods, Christ was beginning to be remembered not by names, but by thirst quenched. Time had passed without ceremony. The villages had changed, and so had the faces. Some of the children Tom had baptized now had children of their own. He himself walked more slowly. His body felt heavier, but the inner flame had not gone out. On the contrary, it burned with a quiet intensity, like embers glowing deep within. He slept little, spoke less. He preferred to sit among the anonymous, observe their eyes, and discern their thirst. But in that season, something began to change. The pain came first, small, sharp, at his fingertips, then in his palms, a burning that grew from the inside out, as if his skin were being torn by something invisible. Toe didn't complain. He simply clenched his fists when no one was looking. He knew that fire wasn't fever. It was memory. Something was approaching. That night, the dream like the visions of the early days, but now more vivid, more intense. Christ appeared to him, not resurrected, not glorified, but wounded. The same eyes, but full of sorrow, the body bleeding, the hand still open, and the voice, deep yet gentle, whispered, "Touch again." Toe tried to approach, but his feet felt like stone. As he raised his hands, he noticed there were holes in them. The wounds were not Christ's, they were his. He woke up breathless, covered in cold sweat, the room dark, wind slipping through the cracks. His palms throbbed like live coals. There was no blood, but the pain was real. He got up, went out, walked through the sleeping village to the hill where he prayed. There he knelt. He said nothing, just raised his hands to the sky like someone waiting for them to be taken. For days the pain remained, but it wasn't punishment. It was a calling. Every touch he had given the sick, every child he had blessed, every leper he had embraced, it all returned to him now as if Christ was saying, "You bore my marks, now carry your own." Those who saw him noticed the change. Tom's gaze was deeper, quieter, his gestures slower, but more intense. He no longer preached with urgency, but with presence. He would sit for hours in silence beside the suffering, and his mere presence was healing. But within him, the dream returned each night. Christ bleeding, the voice saying, "Touch again." In the tradition of the early Eastern Christians, it was said that the marks of true faith were engraved on the bodies of those who sought no reward. And among the ancient Syriacs it was told that Thomas the one who needed to touch to believe, was the only one to carry at the end of his life the same wound he once touched, not visible but burning as a sign that doubt once surrendered becomes an eternal seal. Once a young missionary confronted him. "Why do you still speak so carefully? You already have authority." Tom raised his hand, showed his palm. There was nothing there, but the young man stepped back. "Authority doesn't come from words, but from the fire that consumes without burning," he replied. The rumors began. They said his hands healed before touching, that it hurt to hold a stone, that he wept in his sleep. Some thought it a curse, others a miracle, but Tom offered no explanation. He knew the wounds weren't meant to be shown. They were meant to be remembered. One quiet afternoon, as the wind played with the tamarind leaves, he sat by the well. He looked at the still water, thinking of the woman. He thought of Jerusalem, of the old days, of Peter's voice, of John's silence, of Judas' kiss. He thought of Christ, the one who allowed himself to be touched by a divided heart. Night fell slowly. Tom raised his eyes to the sky as dark as his doubt once was. But now there was no more darkness, only a scar, and in it a name, Yeshua. The fire began before sunrise, a sudden blaze in the middle of the jungle. The main temple in the region, dedicated to an ancient god carved in black stone, burned with red flames that danced like freed spirits. The priests ran with water jars. The guards shouted orders, but nothing stopped the advance of the blaze. By dawn, what had once been an imposing altar was reduced to charcoal and smoke. The central deity, ancient, adorned with gold necklaces and ruby eyes, had been completely consumed. Voices rose. "It was the foreigner," they shouted, "the carpenter of the invisible God." Tom's name echoed like a curse among the ruins. There was no proof, but there was resentment. He spoke of a kingdom without images, of a presence without form. Many listened to him, and that was enough for the priests to hate him. They came for him at noon. They didn't find him preaching or healing. He was sitting beside a paralytic, teaching him how to tie a sandal with one arm. When the guards arrived, he simply stood up, handed the leather strap to the child helping him, and raised his hands in silence. He was taken to the village center where people gathered, half in fear, half in confusion. An elder accused him with a trembling voice. "Your followers speak against our gods. Your eyes condemn our rituals. Now the temple has fallen. What do you say?" Tom stared at the ashes in the distance. Then he looked at the men before him. "Burning stone is easy, but a true temple doesn't make smoke." The priests looked at each other. The high priest stepped forward. "Then where is your temple, foreigner? Show us." Tom approached slowly, stopped in front of one of the accusers, placed his hand on the man's chest. "It's here." Then he turned to the people. "Don't you know that you are God's temple and that God's spirit lives in you?" Corinthians 3:16. Silence fell like a cloak. The words, strange to local ears, silenced even the most outraged. But the plans of the powerful didn't stop. They wanted punishment to restore fear. The trial was brief and the sentence humiliating. Expelled from the village, no shelter allowed, hands bound, left on the jungle's edge. It was an attempt at exile disguised as justice. They expected the forest to devour him, but he survived. For days he wandered the trails, feeding on roots and drops of dew. He slept under trees and softly sang psalms to ward off the cold. He didn't pray for rescue. He only asked that his absence wouldn't extinguish the flame he had planted in their hearts. In the village, something strange began to happen. Those who had converted, even in secret, started gathering in homes. They shared food, cared for the sick, prayed in silence. When someone asked where the new God's temple was, they pointed to themselves. The priests tried to suppress it, but the faith too left behind didn't burn. On the contrary, it grew. Weeks later, when an old convert found him in the forest and begged him to return, Tom hesitated. His feet were wounded, his body thin, his eyes sunken, but his voice still had strength. "If they believed without me, then they don't need me," the man insisted. Said the village wanted to see him. Said many no longer entered any temple, but prayed looking at the sky. "Then let us return," said Tom, "but not to rebuild altars, rather to remember that the altar walks with us." When he arrived, there was no celebration, but he wasn't stoned either. The children came first, bringing fruit, then the women, finally the men. The stone temple no longer existed, but in the square someone had drawn the outline of a heart in the sand and inside it a cross. Tom knelt there, and for the first time in many days, he wept, not from pain, but because he knew that where there is living faith, not even fire can extinguish what the Spirit has already lit. Governor Vazen was feared even before he was seen. His men marched with bamboo spears. His messengers announced orders as if they were divine decrees, and his authority was upheld not by justice but by fear. No word was debated, no order questioned. He was the kind of man who believed obedience was bought with punishment. That was how he heard about Thomas, not with interest, but with irritation. A mad Jew who speaks to the sick and deceives peasants. His advisors warned him that people are starting to listen to him more than to the priests. That was enough. He ordered him brought in. Thomas was dragged from the house where he taught and thrown into the square. He was tired but not afraid. When Vasan saw him, he expected a sorcerer or fanatic. He found a thin man, dark eyes and hands that seemed to have carried more crosses than books. "Are you the disturber of traditions?" Thomas did not reply. The governor grew angry. "Speak or bleed." He then said, "I speak, but only those who thirst will hear." Van ordered, "Whip him, then stone him. If he survives, bathe him in shame." And so it was. The soldiers obeyed gladly. Thomas's back split open with lashes. Stones struck his face, his belly, his knees. Then he was dragged through the streets amid shouts and spitting. He did not murmur, did not curse. He only looked at the sky between each blow. In the end, he was left by the city walls, without bread, without cloak, without defense. Some Christians found him and silently carried him to a cave. There they tended his wounds with oil, leaves, and prayers. "Even in fever," Thomas said, "he too was wounded, and by his stripes we are healed." The next morning, the palace gates were shut. Wazen's daughter, a young woman with calm beauty and an easy laugh, had suddenly fallen ill. High fever, delirium, cold sweat, no remedy worked. The priests mumbled incantations. The doctors applied ashes and roots, but the girl worsened. By late afternoon, her breath stopped for a moment, then returned weakly. The governor trembled. Then he heard a servant murmur, "Maybe the Jew." Vasen did not shout, did not rage. He only murmured, "Is he still alive?" He learned that Thomas was hidden in a cave, recovering from the wounds he himself had ordered. That same night, escorted by a few men, the governor went there. Upon entering, the smell of oil and blood struck him. Thomas lay covered by a simple cloth. When he saw him, Vasen did not speak of power. He only said, "My daughter." Thomas sat up with difficulty, took a deep breath. "What she needs is not in me, but what I have I give." Vasen knelt for the first time. "Save her and all will be yours." Thomas replied, "She is not mine, but I can call upon the one who saved me." Upon arriving at the palace, silence hung heavy. The guards did not dare block them. Thomas went to the room. The girl was delirious, calling old names, asking for light. He approached, touched her forehead, prayed softly, knelt beside the bed, then said, "Daughter, rise." The girl opened her eyes, blinked, whispered, "Who is this man shining?" Vasen fell to his knees, cried like a child, clung to Thomas's feet, repeating, "Forgive me, forgive me." Thomas only placed his hand on his head. "Now you know who rules." And the next morning, the people saw the governor walking alongside the apostle through the streets. No one understood. Vasen ordered the square cleaned, the broken idols buried, the poor fed. The one I persecuted brought life to my house. Many did not believe at first, but the daughter's eyes alive were enough. Thomas asked for no temples, only that the people learn to recognize that the invisible God does not dwell in palaces, but in the humble of heart. And Van, the man who once ordered him stoned, became a protector of the Christians, not by miracle, but by fall. The tide was low, and the night blew warm winds over the southern coast of India. Thomas walked alone, his feet sinking into the damp sand, his robe touching the salty water. The sky clear was an inverted ocean. The apostle did not seek rest. He sought answers. The weeks had been long, full of healings, conflicts, and silent conversions. But that night felt empty. His heart burned with longing, not for his homeland, but for the voice that had first called him. "Do you know me?" He could still hear it. The breeze carried the scent of fish and burnt oil lamps. In the distance, in the dark, points of light appeared on the sea, small, flickering. Thomas stopped. For a moment he thought it was a divine sign, a miracle of fire on water, like echoes of the time Christ walked on the lake. But the points multiplied, gliding gently toward the coast. And then he understood they were canoes, fishermen, many, some with torches in hand, others with baskets in their laps, humble boats made of rough wood, rowing to the sound of deep chants. They came not for fish, they came for words. Thomas stepped back to the dry sand, sat on a rock, and waited. The boats reached the shore with soft creaks. One by one, the men disembarked, barefoot, silent, eyes fixed on him. An elder approached. "We heard that the God of heaven dwells in men. We want to know if it is true." Thomas stood, looked at his hands. They still bore the scars of stoning, leaned on a staff. The God of heaven came down to earth, and then rose into those who believed. "You are light in the dark like these torches." They sat in a circle. No altar, no temple, only sand, fire, and attentive eyes. He spoke slowly without raising his voice. He told of a mountain where the Master said, "You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. Let your light shine before others." Matthew 5:14-16. They listened as one hears childhood stories. When he finished, the youngest asked, "And if the light goes out?" Thomas looked at the sea. "It goes out when it becomes pride. But if it surrender, it remains even after we die." That night, no one returned to the sea. They slept on the beach, burned herbs, shared dried fish, and Thomas stayed awake, watching every flame. In the morning, before the sun rose, they all prayed. No memorized words, just silence and open hands. The following days transformed the coast not into a city but into a beacon. The fishermen returned to the beach every night, brought others, women, children, even elders who once mocked the God without an image. And each time a torch appeared on the sea, Thomas smiled, not out of vanity, but because he remembered Christ's gaze. Go and be light. Once a Persian merchant arrived with news of persecution in the north. He said the followers of the new faith were being hunted. Your name is too well known already. Thomas replied, darkness only hurries when it knows the light is coming. The man left without understanding, but the fisherman understood. One night heavy rain fell. The boats were late. Thomas, now aged, thought they would not come, but in the distance the lights appeared, protected under gourds wrapped in cloth, yet steady. A faith made of salt and wind that cannot be extinguished, not even by the sea. When he left that coast for the last time, Thomas left behind more than disciples. He left torches, left a fire that needed no temple to burn. Men and women who had learned that following Christ was not repeating words, it was being flame in the dark. And when he looked one last time at the sea, he still saw a canoe approaching, a single torch, but steady. And he understood that the kingdom was growing, not in secret, but in silence. It was an ancient temple embedded among dark stones and thick vines, consecrated to a deity that demanded constant sacrifices. The entrance was guarded by coiled columns and hand-carved steps. The people offered rice, fruits, oil, and blood of animals and sometimes of men. There the sacred was synonymous with fear. And it was there that Thomas was summoned, unaware of the trap. He arrived, as always, barefoot with empty hands, carrying only his wooden staff and the voice that was no longer his alone. They told him that a priest was sick, that he needed the prayer of the man of the faceless God. Thomas hesitated, but he went. His heart uneasy pounded like a muffled drum as he crossed the temple threshold. He knew there was no sick man. There was darkness. 4 men surrounded him in the altar's shadows. A blow to the neck, another to the stomach. He fell to his knees, but did not scream. The golden images stared at him with hollow eyes. The priest appeared, wrapped in resin smoke. There is no room for your light here, he said. Here, the fire is ours. Thomas tried to rise, another blow now to the face. Blood trickled slowly to his lips. A stone hit his back, his tunic stained red. Still, he did not curse. He only murmured words only heaven could understand. They dragged him to the altar where a sacrifice had been made hours before, the remains still rare. They threw him there amid the smoke and dried blood. They expected him to die or at least to fall silent. But something different happened. Thomas lifted his head, opened his eyes, and spoke. His voice came not as a groan, but as a trumpet. This altar is of stone, but there is a living altar inside you, and I do not speak for myself. It is not I who speaks. The phrase echoed through the temple like a trapped thunder. The blows stopped. The men stepped back. The priest hesitated. Thomas's body trembled, but his eyes were steady. You want sacrifice? It has already been made. Once for all in Jerusalem, they tried to silence him with a gag, but his words no longer depended on his mouth. The very atmosphere seemed to shake. One of the attackers fell to the ground, hands on his head. Another ran away. The priest raised his hand to give the final order, but hesitated because Thomas's blood, mixed with that of the altar, seemed to glow, not with light, but with meaning. People began to gather at the temple's edges, drawn by the noise, by the change in the air. Thomas stood with difficulty, but he stood, shaking knees, wounded face, soaked garments, but standing. And there in that place built for fear, he proclaimed hope. He spoke of the cross, of the death that defeated death, of the God who does not demand blood, but offers his own. Some laughed, others cried, but no one left the same. That altar, once made sacred by terror, had become a pulpit, and the stones that once imprisoned now bore witness. Thomas was expelled from the temple, but not with scorn, with awe. The priest did not curse him, only watched him like one seeing a crack in the wall of his faith, a crack letting light through. For weeks the story spread through villages. The foreigner bled on the altar. His blood did not plead, it taught. He spoke with fire in his eyes. Many came looking for him afterward, not for the wounds, but for the voice. When asked why he didn't fight back, he replied, because his sword is not of iron, it is of word. And when asked why he didn't flee, he said, because where they try to silence the kingdom, it shouts louder. And so once again, Thomas taught not with miracles, but with scars, and the scars spoke better than any sermon. The sky closed in, not with clouds, but with sound. Thomas, who for years had heard the Spirit's voice through heathen's visions and dreams, now walked through days of stone. No answer, no presence, only silence. A silence so deep it made him doubt his own name. The fire that once burned without consuming now seemed to be an extinguished ember. There was no hidden sin, no rebellion, only a void that didn't scream, but pulled everything into itself. The village remained alive. The followers grew. New converts came with questions, praises, prayers. But Thomas heard them as if under water. The word that once flowed like a river was now rock. He spoke but without feeling, prayed but with no return. His soul knocked on heaven's doors and no one answered. He remembered Elijah hiding in the cave, David crying out in the night, Christ himself silenced in Gethsemane. But memory does not comfort when silence becomes your only companion. He spent long hours sitting by the sea, staring at the horizon, wrote words in the sand with his finger. words the wind erased. One morning he wrote why and didn't wait for an answer because he no longer expected one. At night he lay on the hard ground and remembered the first time he touched the wounds. "My Lord and my God," he had said with certainty. Now he could only whisper, "My Lord." Others didn't notice because Thomas still walked, still taught. But inside his spirit was drying up like a shallow well at the end of the dry season. The worst part wasn't the absence of heaven. It was the absence of the touch, that invisible certainty that had guided him until then. Until an ordinary morning changed everything. The village was slowly waking. Pots clinketed, pitchers knocked. The smell of burning wood announced the day. Thomas was sitting in the shade of a date palm looking at the ground. A child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, approached. She carried a rolled-up leaf, pretending it was parchment. Sat next to him, stayed silent, then said without looking up, "Aba." The word pierced the air like an arrow. In Aramaic, it meant father. But in that context, it was more than a title. It was a call, recognition, intimacy. The child repeated, "Aba, can you teach me to pray?" Thomas looked at her. Her dark eyes shone with pure sincerity. His dry mouth trembled. He couldn't speak. Inside, something crumbled. It was as if all the unanswered prayers, all the dreams that never came, all the empty nights condensed in that moment. And there, through the mouth of a child, God called him back. He received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry, "Aba, Father," Romans 8:15. He had heard it, yes, but only now he understood. He knelt before the child, not as one who teaches, but as one who learns. Placed his hand on her head, and there he prayed for the first time in weeks with tears. No memorized words, only tears, and each tear was a verse, a psalm, a cry, a surrender. The sky did not open, no vision came, but something changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was presence in disguise, like the carpenter in Nazareth, silent while shaping wood, like the master before Pilate, silent without weakness. God was not absent. He was laying foundations. Thomas began to hear again, not with ears, but with the heart. The breeze was now a reply. The child's laughter a revelation, the silence a new language. That afternoon he gathered the disciples, sat among them as one of their own, told the story of the cave where the prophet heard God in a whisper. Then he told of a morning when a child called him Abba, not to remind him of what he was, but of who sustained him. The silence which seemed like punishment revealed itself as blessing, because it is in darkness that roots grow. And Thomas, the twin of doubt, now understood true faith is not born from the answer but from persistence in the silence. Enjoyed it so far? Then subscribe, like and share it with someone. With your support, we can take these messages even further. Let's continue then with the unfolding of this journey. She was called Amdonia, daughter of King Misdios, promised to a warrior prince. Her name echoed like a song of beauty and power through the palace halls. From an early age, she learned to walk with grace, to dance before the golden gods, to obey the will of men. Her fate was sealed, a political alliance, a marriage without choice, a veil over freedom. But fate sometimes bleeds at the edges, and there the seed enters. Thomas saw her for the first time from afar at a public ceremony. He did not look at her with desire, nor with judgment. He simply recognized in her eyes the same restlessness he carried in his soul, a hunger for truth. Days later he heard her story, her resistance to the engagement, the king's anger, and finally the strange whisper that wandered the corridors. She spoke alone at night, said she had heard a voice speaking of another kingdom. Worried, the queen summoned a priest. He declared it a spiritual possession. It was time for an exorcism. But a faithful servant, a mute maid, who heard more than others, took a message to Thomas. He hesitated. Entering the palace meant risking everything, but something in his prayer that night was stronger than fear. "I carry water, let it be blood if necessary." He entered through the back door, covered by a cloak, guided by the maid. Found Magdonia in her room, kneeling before a lamp. Her eyes showed no delirium, but clarity. "I knew you would come," she said without looking up. "Did you hear it?" Thomas asked. She nodded. "Not your voice, his before sleep, before birth." He spoke little, sat on the floor, told her about the Christ who died without a wife, but who wed the world with his blood, spoke of a kingdom inherited not through political alliances but through renunciation. She listened without blinking. At the end she said, "I want to be his." Thomas replied, "It will cost you the world." And she said, "The world is already a prison." At her request, the baptism was done in secret. At midnight they went down to the moon temple where there was a small lake of deep waters used for purifications. Thomas entered first. She followed, dressed in white. He prayed. With trembling hands he immersed her in the dark water. When she emerged her eyes were open like someone who had just seen light for the first time. But lights don't stay hidden for long. The next morning the prince learned that the princess had refused to wear the wedding adornments. King Misdios was informed she had thrown away the sacred necklaces and broken a statue of the god of fertility. He screamed, demanded answers. Amdonia remained silent until finally she said, "I have been consecrated, but not to your altar." The king's fury set the palace ablaze. He ordered Thomas captured, accusing him of witchcraft, seduction, and treason. When they found him, he did not run. He was in prayer as if expecting the sentence. Arrested, whipped, dragged through the streets, he was thrown at the king's feet. Macdonia tried to intervene. The king pushed her away violently. "You are my daughter," she replied. "No longer." The humiliated prince demanded Thomas's execution. The king hesitated. The queen wept. The people divided whispered in prison. Thomas prayed, his back torn, his body feverish, but his soul at peace. He knew that this young woman, now a woman of faith, was the final link in his mission, not for beauty, but for courage, not for royalty, but for renunciation. In the cell, Macdonia visited him, touched his wounded feet, said, "You showed me the bridegroom, and even if they kill me, I will die in light." He smiled. "Then even if I vanish, your faith will stand." It was his final conversion, the costliest, the purest. The central square was packed. Nobles and servants, soldiers and children, all crowded between columns and ropes, waiting for the spectacle King Mystius had prepared. The drums beat slowly. The smoke of pagan incense rose before idols that seemed to watch everything with stone eyes. But the one they awaited was flesh, and he came walking between two guards, barefoot and dusk. Thomas the foreigner, the arsonist of faith, the one blamed for dividing the royal house, the disturber of gods. His body was no longer that of the fisherman from Galilee. The years on the road had etched deep lines in his face. His hands, once a carpenter's, then an apostle's, were now bound, covered with marks. But what struck most was not his posture. It was his gaze, bright, calm, as if he wasn't there. The king stared down at him from the stairway. "Have you anything to say?" Thomas did not reply. The prince, wounded in pride, shouted, "Confess your guilt. You are a traitor, a sorcerer, a deceiver of royal women." No words. The apostle's silence began to disturb more than any blasphemy. One of the judges stepped forward. "If you remain silent, we will consider your crime confessed." Thomas raised his eyes and spoke only once. "My kingdom is not of this world," then returned to silence. The punishment was decreed, public whipping. The king wanted disgrace, pain, and an example. They tied him to a central post in the heart of the square. The first blow tore his shoulder, the second his back. The crowd murmured, some looked away, others shouted words of fear and hatred. With each blow, the flesh split. Blood ran down his bare feet, but Thomas's eyes remained upward, fixed, as if seeing beyond the visible sky, as if seeking another face, one he already knew. And in the midst of pain, someone whispered among the spectators, "He seems to be praying." He did not beg for mercy, did not defend himself. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers, he did not open his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. When the last lash fell, Thomas was untied. He fell to his knees. His legs trembled, but he did not fall face first. He remained upright. The soldiers didn't know what to do. The prince ordered them to spit on him, but even the spit didn't mix with the blood. It was as if something separated it, something invisible, something holy. The king, uneasy, returned to the throne. He had not won because there was no noise, and an enemy who does not scream does not break. That night, Thomas was taken to a cell, the same one where Macdonia had visited him. He was alone now, but not abandoned. Heaven's silence, the one that had hurt him weeks before, was now presence, not absence. He knew the end was near, not because he sensed death, but because he felt fullness. The seed had been sown, the kingdom had made its mark in the east, and even if the world tried to silence it, the eyes of men had seen, and those eyes, like his, would never be the same. In the dark of the cell, he touched his swollen wrists, smiled even with a bruised face, because each wound reminded him of others, the ones he once touched without permission, the ones that tore him within, and now he bore them, not as punishment, but as honor. The sun was already burning high when the guards opened the cell. There was no announcement, no sentence read aloud, just a curt nod. It was time. Toe rose slowly. His body throbbed, but his feet obeyed. His eyes, though swollen, held a brightness that confused soldiers and frightened priests. A light that asked no questions. It simply followed. They descended through the village's narrow streets, then continued in silence toward a hill outside the walls. The villagers knew it was the place of the forgotten, the rebels, the cursed, a mound of dry black stones, twisted palm trees all around. No altar, no cross, only a circle of sand, and 5 sharp spears driven into the ground. The soldiers walked like men who had done this before. But this time, there was no scream, no plea. The prisoner walked ahead as if he knew the path. At the top, Toe stopped. He looked to the sky. The sun pierced his eyes for a moment, but he did not blink. Then he looked around as if saying goodbye to a land that had never been his. One of the soldiers ordered him to kneel. Toe obeyed without resistance. He crossed his hands over his chest. He said nothing. He simply closed his eyes. The captain hesitated. "No last words?" he asked. Toe smiled faintly. "They have already been said." Then he whispered in Aramaic. "Aba." The wind blew, soft but steady, as if every palm leaf bowed to listen. The first soldier stepped forward, gripped the spear with both hands, hesitated a second, and thrust it into the left flank. Toe's body bent slightly, but he did not fall. The second came, struck his shoulder. The blood ran like wine down his tunic. The third pierced him from behind, and at that moment Tommy opened his eyes and looked to the sky. The fourth hesitated. "He's a holy man," he said. The captain shoved him. "He's an agitator." The spear came down, pierced the belly, Toe fell to his knees. The fifth man, trembling, struck the chest. Then the body collapsed forward like a tree pruned from above, but even as he fell, his hand still clutched the sand, as if he wanted to leave it blessed. Silence was absolute. There was no crowd, no witnesses beyond the executioners themselves, but in that instant something shifted in the air. The soldiers looked at each other speechless. One of them began to cry. The wind picked up. One man ran down the hill. Another dropped to his knees. It was as if by killing Tom they had been seen by someone invisible. Later, villagers came to retrieve the body. The king did not protest. It was too late. His daughter no longer spoke to him. The people murmured that night. According to tradition, brought a dream to 5 different soldiers. A man in a light-colored tunic called them by name. One by one, the place was marked with stones, then with simple crosses, much later with a temple, but the ground there was never ordinary again. They say that to this day on the slopes of Mount St. Thomas the wind blows stronger, and those who climb in silence feel that there is more than dust in that soil. There is blood that still speaks. The ground was hot. Blood trickled slowly through the sand, forming tiny red streams between the stones of the hill. Tom's body lying on its side, hands still crossed over his chest, seemed to rest, not fall. The first strike had opened his flank, the second his chest. Air escaped in short bursts, but on his face, a smile no executioner would understand, because it wasn't pain, it was reunion. His half-closed eyes saw beyond the sunlight. The pain faded as if losing strength. The world around fell silent, and then there, between the veil of life and death, he appeared, not with trumpets, not with lightning, just with calm steps descending among the twisted trees as he once walked upon the waters. Toe recognized him. The garment shone with a light not of this world, but that wasn't what held him. It was the hands. The same pierced, scarred, open hands which he once dared to touch in doubt. Now they came toward him, not in reproach, but in tenderness. He said nothing, just extended his hand as he had done years before in the upper room behind locked doors. "Put your finger here. See my hands. Do not be unbelieving, but believe." John 20:27. And Tom understood every step he had taken in the East. Every silent night, every persecution, every miracle hidden in forgotten villages, every spear, every tear, all had led to this moment. It was not an end. It was a return. The presence of Christ enveloped him, but did not pull him away. Instead, it transfigured the world around him. The dry hill became fertile. The breeze became song. The blood, as if touched by light, gleamed. Angels invisible to human eyes bore silent witness. It was not a spectacle. It was consecration. The soldiers had already gone. The people did not yet know. But eternity in that moment sealed its covenant with an apostle who had doubted and therefore believed more deeply than all, because only those who truly wish to believe doubt, only those who wish to feel touch. And Tom had touched the wounds and now became one with them. His eyes closed slowly. The breath ceased, the body lay still, but the smile did not fade, because he knew Christ awaited him, not on a distant throne, but in the sacred space between the wounds and the glory. And so ended the journey of the apostle, forgotten by many, called only Didymus the twin. But he was not a mirror of another man. He was the reflection of a faith built in struggle, in doubt, in touch, in blood. And that in the end finds glory not by what it proclaims, but by the one it saw and recognized. My Lord and my God. The body fell, and no one caught it. Tom collapsed onto the hard ground as if resting, not as if dying. The soldiers, indifferent to what they had done, dragged the body to the base of the hill. No ceremony, no prayer, just a shallow hole dug among the rocks, hastily covered with dry leaves and hot sand. The governor didn't want mourning. He wanted silence. And so he buried the apostle like a foreign criminal, without a name, without marble, without lament. But that very night the rumors began. Watchmen on duty reported lights in the distance, floating over the hill like torches without hands. One swore he heard a song in a language he did not understand. Another found his sandals wet in the morning, though he had slept far from water. They laughed, called it superstition. But no one wanted to stand guard at that spot again. The tomb remained forgotten for years. Locals avoided passing by. Some said leaves would not grow on the sand where the body had been placed. Others claimed children heard footsteps at night, but saw no one. A fisherman swore he saw a man in a light tunic waving from the top of the hill. No one believed him, but all were afraid until a group arrived from the north. They were Syriac Christians led by elders from the city of Edessa. They came with ancient records preserved like relics, according to their chronicles. An apostle named Thomas had preached to the ends of the known world and died there. They carried scrolls, maps, names of now vanished villages. They sought not a throne but bones, bones of a man who had touched Christ's wounds. The local scholars tried to stop them. "There's nothing here," they said, but the foreigners insisted. They climbed the hill dug with their bare hands, and when they opened the earth they found worn wood still damp. Inside there were bones, and among them a piece of cloth stained with dried blood. When they touched it, one of the elders fell to his knees. "He is here," he whispered. "He never left." The news spread, and then something even stranger happened. Birds began to gather around the hill, and in the sky the following night a single star seemed to hover over the place, unmoving, shining like an eternal sentinel. There was no explanation, but there was reverence. Even pagans began visiting the hill in silence. They did not build cathedrals, nor adorned it with gold. They placed only a stone with an inscription. "Here rests Thomas, the one who doubted and saw." Over the centuries, the site would welcome pilgrims, missionaries, seekers. Many came without knowing why. They simply came, and when they knelt in the dust, some wept without understanding. Others said they felt warmth in the sand, a whisper, a presence. Euchaeus of Caesarea recorded, "There is invisible fire on that hill." Theodore of Mopsuestia would write, "The bones of the apostle cry out louder than his voice." And the chronic Edison would conclude with these words, "Death silenced a man, but not his touch. Where his wounds rest, a light burns that never goes out." It was the tomb of an enemy, but to heaven it was the altar of a friend. Too, forgotten by many, became an eternal sign. There was no marble, but there was glory, and the ground that rejected him became sacred. Waves broke gently on the shores of the Malabar coast. Among palm trees and old huts, simple churches rose with clay roofs and crosses carved in dark wood. There, where the world seemed to forget, lived men and women who still prayed in Aramaic. They sang psalms with pronunciations inherited from the Near East. And among the stones of the beaten ground, they lit oil lamps, not for distant saints, but for one man, Thomas. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. Colonizers stepped on that soil without understanding its light. But the Christians of St. Thomas, as they came to be called, never let the fire die. With every generation they told their children he came from far away, spoke little, doubted but touched, and because of that he believed like no one else. There were no paintings, no golden relics. There was memory, and living memory burns brighter than gold. Some laughed. How could a fisherman from Galilee have reached the south of India? But the scrolls hidden for generations spoke. The chant spoke. The ruins of ancient baptistries by forgotten rivers spoke, and the names, Hebrew names given to children with Indian features, spoke. It was no myth. It was blood. It was root. In ancient records, missionaries from Syria and Mesopotamia cited the faith of Thomas as a flame lit at the end of the earth. In Matthew 28-19, Jesus commanded, "Go and make disciples of all nations." Thomas silent obeyed, not by going to Rome nor stopping in Antioch, but crossing deserts, seas, languages, and gods to plant hope where maps didn't reach. And there, at the end of the road, without glory, he built a church with the hands that once touched the wounds. Thomas's courage wasn't in bold words. It was in persistence, in preaching to mocking people, in baptizing with hidden water, in healing without applause, in staying when heaven was silent. And when death came, he did not run. He was struck down, but he didn't fall alone. He fell with open eyes, seeing the Christ he once doubted. And that changed everything. Centuries later, in the silence of a church hidden among coconut trees, an Indian child recites, "My Lord and my God." His eyes shine. He doesn't know Thomas's full name, but he feels it. He knows doubt can be a bridge, not a fall. Touch can be prayer, not scorn. And faith, when born of struggle, never dies. Today, while many forget, others still gather. With oil lamps, with bread, with an ancient tongue. Each lit candle is not just memory, it is a seed. Because Thomas left no throne, he left footprints. And those who follow those footprints find a Christ who needs no proof, but still allows himself to be touched. In the end, the apostle no one expected became the flame no one could extinguish. The one who doubted taught others to believe. The one who touched taught the world to feel. And his voice, hidden among tropical forests and whispered prayers in humble homes, still echoes like an ancient secret too sacred to be forgotten. The next stories are already appearing on your screen. Tap, choose, and continue exploring the forgotten mysteries of Scripture. There is much more to be revealed. Thank you for walking with us this far. It was an honor to share this journey with you. May we meet again in the next revelation.